Hello and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Babington.
We're not going back to Malaysia, but Malaysia is coming to us. Today's episode is all about how politics can impact sustainability, the role of intergovernmental organisations like ASEAN, and how young voices can influence it all. Jan, we're 100.
Well, I feel 100, if that's what you mean. Yes, it's our 100th episode, which is, really super.
I don't know if when we started this we thought we'd get to 100, but that's where we are.
We are indeed. And it feels like a nice time to celebrate making it that far, but also to ask some big questions, 100th anniversary questions.
Yes, 100th anniversary makes it seem like 100 years, so I'm going to cut you off there and say we're not 100th anniversary, but 100th episode, definitely.
Yes. Okay,
yes.
Fair enough.
Yeah, 100th anniversary, that really would be old if we'd reached our 100th anniversary. Maybe, if this all goes well and new technologies emerge to allow us to transfer our brains into some kind of artificial being, then yes, we'll have a 100th anniversary, but otherwise I'll just stick with 100th episode.
I don't think you want to spend eternity with me, Paul. That's just a thought.
No, actually, now you've mentioned it, yes, let's hope we don't reach our 100th anniversary. So we've covered so many big topics across the 100th episode. We've covered topics on this planet, we've covered topics in this country, we've covered topics all around the world, and we've covered topics out of space.
One of the things we did look at quite a bit is the situation in Malaysia when we had our mini-series from colleagues in Malaysia. So I think that's, if you like, one of the places where we have looked a bit more in depth outside of the UK. Yeah,
so at the start of this year we had 4 episodes in Malaysia, both with people at Somewhere University and also people outside of Somewhere University. We had such a good time over there as well, learning a lot more about the sustainability attitudes and operations at universities, within businesses in Malaysia, the various projects that go on there. It really was a big part of our year.
Shall we keep on doing that?
Well, yes, for our 100th episode, we've brought in a special guest, someone who has come from Malaysia to us. So we've returned the hospitality. We've not quite returned the weather for him that we enjoyed whilst over there in KL, but we have returned the hospitality. And we're going to welcome Nick Nazmi, who's visiting the UK presently. He stopped by the Pentland Centre, and that's after you met him while we were on our visit to KL. Nick's a parliamentarian in Malaysia, and he has held a ministerial role in the Department for Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I do enjoy the weather here, actually.
Yes, it's slightly different to Kuala Lumpur, isn't
Definitely.
it? Just slightly different. Yeah. Yes, no, we did have such a wonderful time there, though, meeting so many people. And we discussed at the time, while we were out there, there was so much going on about the hosting of ASEAN for this year, and lots of messaging around sustainability there. And I think it was so obvious to me and Jan that sustainability was a big part of quite a lot of discussions while we were in KL.
And I should also say, particularly for our listeners, is it's about the power of connection as well. So I have a very good friend and colleague who I worked with when I was at University of Birmingham, who is also a friend and colleague of Nick's as well. So Itlan Zakaria is really the person who put us together. And so it's kind of like 2 degrees. With one common friend, you can be in a conversation with somebody who has an enormous array of experience outside my own. So particularly if you're new to the business world or you're still a student studying, watch out for your school colleagues who are going to be really interesting and be doing really interesting things that you can find out more about that in the future.
It brings me to wonder if you are the sustainability equivalent of Kevin Bacon.
I'm really, he advertises phones.
Yeah, it's wonderful that one of the most famous actors from Hollywood in the 80s and 90s has been reduced in your mindset to someone who now is seen on TV advertising phones. But yeah, there's a game called, I think it's either 5 degrees or 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon.
Oh,
where
right.
anyone and everyone, it might even be 3 degrees of Kevin Bacon, anyone and everyone who has ever been in any kind of film can be connected to Kevin Bacon in no more than so many steps. So I think you are the sustainability equivalent of Kevin Bacon.
Well, thank you. I know. Thank you. With apologies to Mr. Bacon and his very fine filmmaking career.
I dare say you'd be delighted if you had quite as much money as Kevin Bacon.
Yes,
and were quite as well recognised globally and had quite as much of a Hollywood career. But that aside, you were definitely Kevin Bacon. in regards to connections within sustainability.
Heavens.
But it is wonderful. That has provided us with the opportunity to welcome you here, Nick, to discuss with you lots of important topics around how it works in politics and government when it comes to sustainability, because we quite often talk about it from the side of academics who sometimes work with government, but it's good to have someone who's got that experience from the other side.
Excellent. So that might be a good time to ask you, what kind of path did you follow that resulted in you being elected to the Malaysian Parliament? And was that always in your heart of hearts something that you wanted to do?
Yeah, unfortunately, I had quite a boring. I was the geek, the political geek, since I was in school, and I was involved in Malaysian politics before I arrived in the UK as an undergrad. And the moment I came here, I was in Labour students. I was in the Islamic societies and the NUS. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it was that much of a surprise for me to end up as an elected legislator. But, the only thing that was slightly different for me was that, I had certain ideas with regards to reform, with regards to multiracial politics that I was not in the mainstream, right? So I think that was the only thing that maybe people would have said that if he was in the traditional parties, he would have made it to parliament. But I've been very fortunate with the timing that I've been able to be a minister and an MP.
When you say not in the mainstream, how does that work in Malaysia then? Because here in the UK, say, up until 20 years ago, you would have said two parties and really only two parties, which is Labour and Conservative. There's since been the emergence of the SNP in Scotland.
Yep.
There's been the growth of the Liberal Democrats over the past 20 years from a very minor party into one that has a decent number of seats in Parliament. And then you've got the very well publicised rise of Reform in the last few years as well. So how does it work in Malaysia with regards to party politics in the mainstream and what sits in and out of the mainstream?
Yeah, well, our system, we took it lock, stock and barrel pretty much from the UK. It's first past the post. We have a parliament with an upper house, appointed upper house. But for me, I mean, the equivalent, I would say, was when I graduated in 2005 from King's College London. I went back and I got active in this multiracial reformist party, centre-left, I would say. It was a party that was formed 6 years before that. We had, at that time, just one parliamentary seat, which is less than the Green Party now, I guess.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But in 2008, we ended up with 30 over parliamentary seats, and which we continue to hold on today, and we took over a few state governments. It was an outsider party, but which has, I think, established itself quite well in Malaysian politics.
So moving to your ministerial post, what does it feel like to be a minister, and what kind of change do you see as being possible from that post? Because of course we think you're the minister, you can do what you like, but of course no one can do what they like. It's always within a system and in a context.
Well, yeah, and to put it into perspective, again, being the political geek that I was, I watched a lot of yes ministers, and the appointment was pretty much the same, right? So, and I got to know about 30 minutes before the Prime Minister announced the cabinet, and I was in the rank of the party, relatively senior, but not super senior in the party, and I was not in a position to demand the portfolio. So the Prime Minister just called up and said, I want to appoint you as a minister for. At that time, it was called Natural Resources, Environment and Climate Change, right? And it was the merger of two previous ministries, and it's a huge ministry at that time. I could just say thank you, right? And I had to do a lot of reading up, and I think I've been in frontline politics since 2008, and I've had some pet issues related to the environment, but people would not generally associate me with the environment. So I had to do a lot of reading up and a lot of learning and all that. And it was, I publicly said it was a bit like going back to university again. All these terms from COP for biodiversity, for climate change and all that. And my father was a permanent secretary. So I understood how civil service and government works. But then I came to appreciate that, the position of the minister, it's about giving that political direction, that vision to the civil service. But it's also about getting the buy-in from my colleagues in cabinet, particularly the prime minister. I found out that in cabinet, I was a bit like that boring student that, I was a bit like a prefect, talking about the environment and climate when you have other ministers talking about jobs and growing the economy and, those sort of things, which seemed more central to how parties win elections, right? So I had to be that voice and how do I make myself relevant to my colleagues to understand that it is important for us to make some difficult decisions.
Have you found that your efforts and the efforts of others around you have helped to push the environment, climate change, etc., up the agenda in Malaysia? Did you find that people started to take it more seriously and that you were no longer seen as you described, the boring prefect in the corner who keeps carping on about that one topic?
Yeah, because I was never that student in school. But I would say that because I think, with all due respect, but my predecessor probably did not really push a lot about the issue. And I think having me there sort of helped articulate this the issues at hand. And I think the other approach that I took was to involve the civil society in a lot of deliberations. We had a climate change advisory and consultative committee, which is made up of businesses, civil society, and even youth NGOs. Because I think their voices are often, ignored in the room. People talk about Greta Thunberg and all that, but in Malaysia, we did not have enough of those voices. And I brought them even to the meetings chaired by the Prime Minister on climate change. I was a bit worried about what they would say to the Prime Minister, but I thought that it's important to have that voice, right? And I think that helped and people appreciate that. But, that's my own evaluation, which is not entirely objective.
So the name of the department when you started then was Natural Resources, Environment and Climate Change.
Yep.
Do you think there was maybe an expectation that you'd focus on maybe the natural resources aspect when you took it on? Because I know that obviously natural resources and Malaysia go together so much. A lot of the discussions we had when we were over there were about the industries that are based there, the petroleum industries most obviously. Do you think that was maybe seen as that's where your focus would be?
Yeah, the name is natural resources, but in reality, natural resources, it's about forests, it's about land, and it's about minerals, other than petroleum, oil and gas, right? So that one is under the Prime Minister, all right? So rare earths would be under me, and in reality, and wildlife as well is considered natural resources, but in practice, a lot of things with regards to land and forest, it falls under the state. So, I have that sort of advisory role, but the real powers, whether you want to deforest, de-gazette a forest land and whatnot, that's all under the state governments. So that was a tricky part.
And I'd like to circle back round to the bringing in of the youth voice into the process, because we've earlier on in this series, our listeners will remember we were talking about generational governance and whether or not there is this generational effect. In that policy environment, did you observe generational effects in terms that the younger people were more ambitious or more committed, or was it sort of bimodal? Because I sometimes think as people get older, they also get more committed to the longevity of the earth. So what kind of generational effects did you see in your time?
Yeah, we had hardcore civil society activists who have been probably, they were there present at Rio in 1992, right? And they've been to every COP, right? And so you have that perspective. They really believe and they fight for their cause. But you have this young, articulate kids who were, they are as young as we had. Our youngest speaker at COP in Dubai was a 12-year-old boy from Malaysia, right? Obviously, there's that, they are, some of them are very young, very new into this stuff, but they have that, not just earnestness, but that passion. And I think, that sense of don't leave us, the youth, with, a broken planet. That sense of urgency. And I felt that, it's, again, when I involved the civil society, I even involved the corporates, I involved the youth, I don't have to agree with everyone, right? But I think it's important that we understand their perspective and try to get ownership.
Did the young people change your mind on anything?
Yeah, well, I think the young people pushed me to be more imaginative. And I guess in a way, it helps me to convince my colleagues again at cabinet. Because a lot of things are interrelated and not entirely my power. And then, the energy, water, flood mitigation, which was under my department in my first year when the ministry was split and renamed, then those things fell under a different minister, the deputy prime minister. So I had to get them on board. And I think, well, I know this sounds very, it shouldn't be like that. But in reality was that I could tell my colleagues that the young people care about this and it will matter in elections.
Mm-hmm.
And we've only had 18-year-olds being able to vote since 2022 in Malaysian elections, right? So I'm telling my colleagues that that's sometimes the easiest way to talk to politicians, unfortunately. But I told them that, if we ignore these issues, then, we will get punished. So we have to be able to champion these issues as well. And the other part, to be fair to my colleagues, is they realize that the floods have gotten worse and worse. They've seen the impact, and they see that you can't solve the floods without dealing with climate change. So that also helped me in my case.
And in that, you're sort of straying into the question that I wanted to ask as well. So what kind of issues were really relevant for Malaysia in a policy context? And you've highlighted floods, but some of those things are also relevant on an international basis as well. So what kind of things were really exercising you?
Well, I think on an international scale, the other part was on waste, right? Because Malaysia, unfortunately, we take in a lot of plastic as well as electronic waste from the world. Plastic, it's partially legal. I mean, there are legal waste that with permits coming into the country. But electronic waste is totally supposed to be illegal. But it still comes in, particularly after China basically closed down their borders to waste in 2018. So a lot of those ships, predominantly, a lot were from the US and Japan. And I think the EU has taken action as well, where they are not going to send plastic waste to non-OECD countries anymore. But so that was a major problem because I think for Malaysia, we are already a high middle income country. Within the next 3-4 years, we are supposed to be able to become a high income country. And for us to be processing waste, I mean, this is not an industry we want to be in, right? I mean, we can go on another debate about data centers and all that, but at least, that's a high-end sector as opposed to processing plastics and electronic waste.
Yeah, we had a mini-series right at the very start of this year on something that we do here at Lancaster called the Plastic Packaging in People's Lives project. And there is an offshoot of that, actually, which is going in Malaysia with Sunway University, looking at those exact issues that you talk about. And it's fascinating because I know that looks at the fact that we here in Britain might not think our plastic waste affects people elsewhere, but it's ending up in countries like yours in Malaysia, which is just showing how it is a global issue. And obviously sustainability itself is a global issue and climate change is a global issue. But you don't always think that the small things like packets of crisps or plastic packaging off your cereal, things like that are affecting people around the world, but they are.
Yes, they are. And I think, and I mean, part of it is also our problem where we do not recycle enough in Malaysia. We are a major plastic manufacturer. So as people demand for more and more recycled content in plastic products, and our manufacturers cannot get enough from Malaysia, so then they have to reach out overseas. So I think that's where we're trying to say, let's try to recycle our own first. And, so it's an ongoing process. And plastics is a whole conversation. And that was tough. I think, honestly, plastics, which I unfortunately did not succeed, was Malaysia took a very passive stand on the Global Plastic Treaty. And partly because, when I speak to my civil servants and all that, they always perceive industry as only oil and gas and plastics. I kept telling them that the food manufacturers, the retail, those who make cosmetics and what, they are also industry, and they are a bit more pragmatic because they just want a clear policy that they know how to design their products. They're quite agnostic whether it's plastic or paper. So we were trying to engage, but unfortunately that did not happen. And I think so far we've taken slightly a position that is more closer to the plastic industry and oil and gas industry on plastics rather than on sustainability.
How do you find attitudes across the Southeast Asian region then? I mentioned that ASEAN has been in Malaysia this year with that message all around sustainability issues. Do you feel that Malaysia has similar attitudes to the countries around you in general, or are there different aspects coming in from these different countries?
Well, yeah, I know talking about the EU in UK is not the greatest thing, but no, I think whatever it is, ASEAN, in certain ways, we want to be the EU of Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. But in reality, we do not have a parliament. It's not we are not unified. We do not have the same institutions that the EU has. And you have absolute monarchies. You have, countries that are still communist, nominally communist, and you have liberal democracies of various extents in this region, right? So it's very diverse. So I would say that that has been the challenge because, again, I think one of the things that the EU, in my view, has succeeded is giving that one strong voice for Europe. And we should use ASEAN as that equivalent in Southeast Asia because Malaysia alone, Indonesia, they are 250 million. They are huge. They're G20. But Malaysia, we are a country of 35 million, right? So, but unfortunately, we have not been able to do it properly. We are trying to work with some like-minded countries in the region. But there's a lot of... So, for example, Indonesia, they see themselves as quite a big country on their own. Why do they need to go through ASEAN? Singapore, they're very smart. They're very developed, but they work with the small island states. So, while you can still work in various groups, but it undermines that coherent ASEAN voice.
That brings us very nicely, actually, talking about ASEAN and the EU, to things such as the United Nations.
Yeah.
Now, you've spoke at Conference of Parties, the COP meetings that you've already mentioned, the first one in Rio back in 1992. You've spoken at the United Nations. So what do you see as the function of these meetings when it comes to issues around the environment, climate, sustainability?
Yeah, it's easy to get lost and find, what's the whole purpose of it. But, you do realize that at the end of the day, we need to do things together. And I think one of the things we know is under challenge today is the fact that the world, out of the nightmare of the Second World War, the world realized that we need to find certain, we need to have these institutions and to find common solutions to problems that are global in nature. So, it's not an easy process and you have to buy a whole new dictionary just to understand the language. And at the same time, I need to communicate it to my, going back to my voters who are ultimately my clients.
It sounds just like communicating with academics, having to learn a whole new language.
Steady on, I'm not having you two gang up on me.
So I think that was the challenge, but I do find that it was useful. But we are in a challenging time. I appreciate the leadership of, for example, the UN Secretary General on the climate crisis. But when you have countries, and I was in Dubai, Malaysia shared our pavilion was part of the same building as China. So you could see at that time, COP28 in 2023. John Kerry going up the corridors, because once the US and China agrees, then a lot of things get done. But that was then, right? And things are different now. And I think that has been the challenge. And at the same time, unfortunately, when you see inaction from the big powers like the US, you see developing countries also making it as an excuse not to do anything, right? Just blame. I totally agree that the impacts of colonialism on the environment, and you shouldn't judge a Malaysian petrol industry the same way you judge the industry in a developed world and all that, and I totally agree. But at the same time, we need to realize that the problem is here, and we need to do things without just pushing it on others, blaming it on others. But when the world's, the biggest polluter in the world does not take responsibility, then it's a bit difficult to get things done, right? And also, I mean, I think China, at least in terms of sustainability, I think they've advanced a lot and they've shown that a lot of good things that can be done. But now there's no competition, right? I mean, they do not, in the past, they had to show that they're better than the US. But now if there's no push for that, it's, then I'm afraid about the world progressing from that.
How does it make you feel when you hear the President of the United States speaking at the UN General Assembly and saying things like he did recently, such as climate change being the biggest hoax the world has ever known, etc. As someone who is, I would guess, on about as not quite as far, but I guess a long way away from him on the political spectrum as you can get, that must be so frustrating. It
is, because it gives legitimacy to things which were seen in the past as, in the margins or out of the mainstream. But fortunately, I mean, we do not see much of that in Malaysia yet, in terms of, I don't think anyone denies per se, major politicians deny climate change. But it does, it's, that you don't have that sense of that feet on the brake, and that in the past when you had the US, you had the EU, and you had China all pushing on this, it sort of created that momentum. And we know, I mean, corporates, for example, a lot of them pay lip service to all these things. But, and while we can all be cynical about that, but when they do not even have to pay lip service, then it's worse for the world.
You are in a different position.
Yeah.
So we have quite an international listenership on this podcast. So and rather than focus on uninspiring leaders, I might ask you.
He inspires people, just in not the ways that I would like, certainly.
Exactly. Yes. Definitions are hard to come by here. Given this, your chance to interact with people in similar roles to yourself, but also within the UN system, who have you encountered that you really think, there's a really inspiring leader who really has the ability to articulate about this issue and bring people alongside?
Well, okay, one, I mean, before we go to that, I mean, one thing we can learn from Trump, I think, is storytelling. And I think that's where a lot of progressives, a lot of leaders in the climate world, for example, are not able to do so. And if you are stuck in the language of COP, in that abstract language and all that, which is useful for negotiations, but it's not useful for going back to your electorate, right? So I think that's where Trump has succeeded in telling that story. One of the persons I've had the privilege of learning a lot from is actually the environment minister for Brazil, Marina da Silva, who has served in that portfolio before during Lula's earlier administration. I think she was a rubber tapper, only learned to read at about 18 or 19 years old. Her husband was killed by the timber gangsters involved with the timber industry. I mean, she doesn't speak English and I don't speak Portuguese, but I engage a lot with her teams and her story. And I think, and she actually resigned at one point from the cabinet, unhappy at climate policies of Lula in the past. And she stood against Lula on a different party platform for president. And she lost, but Lula still appointed her as environment minister. And I think, Malaysia shares a lot of similarities with Brazil, being a developing country. I admire them for trying to do fighting for climate justice. I've people like Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, the Prime Minister. I've had the privilege of meeting her once. But I just like, and again, I think I can't speak. I assume that my Brazilian former counterpart can tell a story well because of how successful she is. But certainly like Ardern and all that. And these are the things that we need, the people that we need. And finally, I think, and one of the, when I wrote my book on the environment, the inspiration was after reading Sadiq Khan's Breathe. I've never had the privilege of meeting him per se, but I feel that I know he has a tough time of now pushing things through, but I do admire how he was able to weave something as, the story of a kid dying from air pollution to inform of what he was doing in London. And that storytelling ability was very inspiring.
You may not have met him, but he certainly seemed to like your book, judging by the fact his name is quoted on the front of it, advocating for the book. I want to move away from politics and move towards business and the businesses you may have come across in your work in ministry and in politics. And have you come across businesses who can be a force for good, who can help when it comes to sustainability? And what kind of examples have you seen of them doing that?
I do, and I've seen one of the in the West companies that tend to have the worst names in the environment. Malaysian companies are the palm oil companies, and I do not dispute that there have been problems with regards to deforestation and all that. But I do think, that other than the side that palm oil in itself is something that is probably one of the most efficient vegetable oils that you can get. That's one. But two, as a result of all these pressures, I see a lot of this, at least the listed ones, they're doing a lot of things. They're changing their practices, and they are also trying to tell their story. Again, you'll see some that are more of a greenwashing stuff and some are more genuine. But I do see a lot of good practices that are starting now. There's a plantation that's starting that have succeeded with a wildlife corridor. For the elephants in Borneo, we've seen another company that's investing a lot in tiger conservation, and also the indigenous tribes that live near them, as well as in their property projects to actually incorporate a lot more of sustainable and green practices, linking it with forests and whatnot. And that becomes a selling point now, right? So I think, because the at the end of the day, when we like to tell individuals, use less plastic, travel less, so on and so forth. It's all well and great, but at the end of the day, if the governments and the corporates do not take action, you do not see that big systemic changes. And I think what has been inspiring is that some of these changes at the corporate level, it has led to some big impacts.
So starting to draw our conversation to a close and reflecting on what individuals can do and what has to change in the system, what advices would you give our listeners about how they can make a substantive difference in the world?
Well, I think the most important thing, and we were talking about people who deny the science of climate change, and there are people like that, and I think there's a long way to convert them to the cause, but we forget that among those who accept the science, the rest of the world, and I believe that's the vast majority in the world, there's also a lot of people who feel that there's no more hope, and it's too late to do something about it, right? And we are all, again, going back to the idea that how much can we really change as individuals? But I think that's where we need to win them over, because these are people who already believe in the science. It's just about telling them that we should. I believe that there's still a chance for us to limit the damage, and also to adapt better to climate change and all that, and to actually do something. Obviously, we do not know how things will end up, but I think just that, rather than being passive, that sense of being victims, but actually taking ownership and doing something, I think that is more positive. So I think that is something, and you can, if you read about stories, and the way the media needs to sell themselves today, they have to tell all this. The headlines need to be, the worst possible headlines to scare people and all that. But you try to find stories of, there are a lot of successful rewilding, successful efforts to adapt to climate change, and all those stories, I think, are the ones that we should be sharing, so that people are more hopeful and believe that they can do something impactful to save the planet.
Do you think that people can influence politicians if they speak with a loud enough voice to get them to act more on sustainability issues?
Definitely, right? So I think, why do we have politicians pandering to certain causes today is because, rightly or wrongly, the loudest voices, and the media does not help, are talking about those issues, right? So if you're talking about immigration, for example, then the politicians will fall into line. So, I mean, for politicians, it's all about how do they keep their job. And that is what it is. For some of them, yes, they want to do good. For a lot of them, it's just how they keep their jobs, right? So if they believe that doing good, saving the planet is what people care about, and is how people will decide whether they will vote for you or not, then then that will change their minds, because that is what democracy is all about. But unfortunately, I think that message is not getting out enough. Even in the developed world, where we suddenly see some people trying to link actions against climate change and all that are making things more expensive and all that, and that does not help, right? So I think people need to send out the message that they want their politicians to take action on this, and that will be how they vote, and I think that politicians will definitely listen.
What I like about that message is it's not just turning up once every 3 or 4 years or however often and voting, but it's actually a continuous process of political engagement. So I'm a bit of a politics geek as well, so that resonates with me rather strongly.
And I think we should probably draw to a close then, but just before we do that, just a final question, just sort of looking at the future, or the near future certainly. Where do you see the sustainability agenda going next? What are you thinking are the most substantive challenges that we're facing right now that are going to be addressed?
Well, on one hand, I mean, it's not going to go anywhere in spite of efforts to push it to the margins. But obviously, the more urgent thing, people will be talking more and more about that have we crossed that threshold of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius and all that. But fundamentally, I think, which we do not talk about enough, and something that I learned only when I became a minister, is on adaptation, right? Because we need to realize that even at 1.5, that best case scenario that seems more difficult today than ever, even if keeping it at 1.5, there will be sea level rise. There will be changes in urban heat islands and all that. So how do we adapt to that? And then we also have to bear in mind that it might be worse, right? It might be 2 degrees or more. So that effort on adaptation, which we are already seeing, the floods are getting worse, the heat waves are getting worse. Malaysians, we used to think that we can cope with a lot of heat, but now we realize that there is a limit. So I think these things need to be worked out, and adaptation is the next aspect that the world needs to focus on, beyond net zero and all that.
Well, Nick, that has been a great conversation. It's been wonderful to get the insights into someone who's worked in government and who has worked globally with other governments as well, just to see that perspective on how sustainability is seen within and without government.
Thank you.
It really is interesting, Jan, to get that inside line, that internal perspective on what it's like to be in government, trying to bring about change when it comes to sustainability and environmental policies.
And there are many things I took away from our conversation, but 2 big ones is storytelling and being able to do that well, but also that hope is still something that we ought to be both an active developer of our own hope, but also maybe not to transmit unhopefulness.
It was interesting to me as well to see the growth of the group, the party that Nick's a member of, and how that almost parallels the Greens in this country as well. It seems like they've got a lot more members of parliament than the Greens have over here, but just that proportional growth from something that was a really minor voice to becoming a lot more major, really reflecting the change in attitudes there has been globally, albeit we might start to worry about a swing back the other way with some of the politicians we've mentioned. But yeah, just seeing that growth over so many decades.
And when Nick was talking about civil society actors, I was really struck. He said that there are people who were there at the Rio conference in 1992. And so that's actually, I'd never thought about those folk. I mean, I was around and I knew it was going on, but there's no way I was ever going to be at that. In fact, I've never been at any one of these big meetings for quite obvious reasons. Yes, indeed. I'm not nearly able to sort of access that level of power and influence. But those Rio legacies are absolutely something that I might go away and think about how we could capture that within the Pentland Centre, because there'll be both business leaders as well as political leaders who have been, active and on the ball since '92, which is a decent period of time ago.
We've talked in the past about Paris and the climate agreement there and how that's effects have rolled on down the years. We've talked about the plastics treaties and the discussions there and how they roll on and continue to roll on through the years. And yeah, it's just another aspect of that, just going back even further, to that 33 years ago, and seeing that those effects and the people who were there are still active, still have a voice now, albeit in a different environment, both literally and metaphorically.
And we also have touched down in this sort of broad-ranging interview, we've touched down in places like waste, which we've had quite a bit of work on.
And Indigenous tribes as well, because
Indeed.
That's something that we've discussed as well, Indigenous people and the effects on them.
But also I thought was quite interesting is that, I know Brazil's there, and I think Brazil is an amazing country, but Brazil wouldn't necessarily leap to the forefront of our mind in the UK if we're thinking about global actors. But that's quite important to realise that other groups...
I almost disagree on that, in as much as because Brazil is the home to the majority of the Amazon, and what happens in the Amazon affects what's going on all around the world, and the global tipping points that we talk about, and the fact that the Amazon and the deforestation there. I think that in that regard, I think Brazil has a big role to play. And I think that the politics in Brazil with Lula and Bolsonaro, the two very extremes of the political system there, and seeing how it goes on with all the logging companies. Yeah, I think
maybe it's just my wee blind spot, but it was nice to see Brazil back in the conversation.
I think it's a New Zealand prejudice that the New Zealand people are obviously have a prejudice towards people from Brazil.
If you don't flank the Pacific, we don't care.
Yes,
is that what you're saying?
Exactly, yeah. Because Brazil only has an Atlantic coast, you're just not interested. But for once, you were not the most famous New Zealander mentioned on the podcast either.
Look,
because
I would give almost anything to meet Jacinta, but I doubt that's going to happen either.
No, but such a good example, though, of that voice that can speak at a global level. And I know that she is no longer the Prime Minister of New Zealand, but she still has that influence and voice. You still see her featuring here, there and everywhere in the media.
And I think that storytelling that she offers up is amazing.
Yes, yeah.
So, do you feel tired, Paul? You ready for a wee rest?
Frequently. Especially after an hour spent in your company, Jo. I feel reasonably lively. I'm ready to give it a go again next year.
Good.
Yes.
So we've got a merry midwinter celebration coming up for some folk in the northern
I'll
latitudes.
just say Happy Christmas because that's what it is. Whether you're in summer or winter, it is Happy Christmas,
that's
and
true.
it will be a new year.
Yes.
So yeah, we'll say Happy Christmas, Happy New Year to all of our listeners. We will be back in the new year with a whole series of new guests covering some more fascinating topics, all touching on sustainability and business.
I look forward to it.
Until then, thank you very much for listening. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jane Babington.